He said I was never there. He said it with a casual shrug, his voice clear and convincing as he explained to his new wife how he'd gotten to where he was on his own. I was still in the room, just a few steps away, holding the baby shower card I'd written for them still unsigned. My fingers tightened around the envelope, not out of anger but from something deeper, a rupture, a kind of disbelief that doesn't scream, it simply sinks. I stared at his face, now older, cleaner, full of pride, the same face I used to wipe after school when he cried over failing math. The same voice that used to whisper, "Don't tell anyone, I got scared during the presentation." And yet there, he was presenting his life as if I had been a distant observer. "She wasn't really involved," he continued. "She kind of drifted in and out." Drifted. I skipped rent once to pay his overdue tuition. I worked night shifts through the flu. I pawned my wedding ring to buy him a plane ticket when his class went abroad. I didn't drift, I anchored. But in front of this carefully curated group of friends and new family, I had no place, no name, just a polite smile and a folding chair in the back. No one looked at me, no one asked, and I realized the worst part wasn't being forgotten. It was being rewritten, turned into a ghost story people politely nod through, ever knowing how much of the house was built by your hands. I remember the first time he called me from college. His voice trembled between pride and panic. He'd gotten the scholarship, but it didn't cover housing. "Just the first few months, Mom," he said, "just until I figure it out." I didn't hesitate. I didn't tell him I'd just been laid off that same morning. I didn't mention that the electricity bill was still sitting unpaid on the counter. I simply smiled through the phone and said, "Of course." I pulled out my sewing machine and took in more mending work from neighbors. I stretched cans of soup across days. I declined dinner invitations I could no longer afford to fake my way through. And every month, without fail, I sent him a check. Sometimes it was small, sometimes barely enough to make a difference. But it always came with a handwritten note. "You're not alone." That was my promise. That no matter how far away he went, I would be the shadow in the hallway when the lights felt too harsh. But at that gathering, as I stood near the buffet I had helped pay for, I realized that all those envelopes, all those little sacrifices, had disappeared into a memory he had repainted. I was no longer the mother who stayed up late sewing buttons. I had become someone who left. And maybe that's the part that stings the most, not just being excluded, but being erased. My name wasn't whispered with gratitude or even regret. It was replaced with silence, as if I had been a footnote in a story I'd written by hand. I stood in that room longer than I should have, clutching the small crocheted blanket I had made for his graduation, a gift I never got to hand him. The laughter around me was warm, echoing with stories I wasn't part of. A woman beside me's wife, I assumed held court as if she had always been there, and maybe that's what burned the most. Not her presence, but my absence. She looked at me with a polite confusion, as if trying to place me, as if I were someone's old neighbor or a forgotten teacher from elementary school. I wanted to speak. I wanted to scream. The nights I stayed up folding uniforms. The mornings I went without so he wouldn't feel different from the others. I wanted to tell her about the poems he used to write, the ones he tucked into my lunchbox when he was 8, but my mouth wouldn't open, not because I lacked words, but because I realized they would fall into an audience already told a different version. I saw him, at the edge of the room, smiling wide, his hand resting on her shoulder, his other hand raising a glass as he spoke. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I saw the absence of my name on his lips. I saw the weight of my sacrifices dissolve into air, and then I saw it, the tiny gesture he made as they clapped, a nod toward her, as if she'd been the one who had held his story together. My arms dropped to my side, the blanket slipping to the floor, unnoticed. It started with small omissions. In his college newsletters, his inspirations were always professors or mentors I had never heard of. When the first scholarship photo arrived, I wasn't listed under the family section. I told myself it was a mistake. Maybe the editor had trimmed the caption. But then came the interview clip, a glowing segment about his rise, from humble beginnings to academic acclaim. And there, on national television, he smiled and said, "It was just me and my drive." I watched it alone on a secondhand laptop I had bought him when he was 16, the same one I had worked weekend shifts to afford. I didn't cry right away. I rewound it, listened again, word for word, not a single mention. Not of the apartment I cleaned 3 times over so he could study in silence. Not of the homemade dinners I packed for long library nights. Not even of the fact that, while other parents took vacations, I had sent every paycheck, every single one, to ensure he had a shot. I remember looking at the TV and whispering, maybe he forgot, but even I didn't believe that. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was erasure, a quiet, strategic erasure. And in that moment, something shifted in me. Not bitterness, not rage, just a deep, aching silence. like standing in a house you built from scratch, only to be told you've never lived there. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, trying to find one reason, just one, that could justify how easily I had been written out of the story I helped create. I began to retrace every sacrifice, not to convince him but to remind myself I hadn't imagined them. The bus rides at dawn to clean offices before my real shift. The nights I sat outside his tutoring sessions, waiting with a scarf over my head to shield from the cold, pretending I wasn't hungry when he offered to share his sandwich. I remembered the time he needed lab equipment his school couldn't provide, and I pawned the last necklace my mother had given me. Not once did I hesitate, not because I was selfless, but because I believed in him. I believed his future would honor the weight of those sacrifices. But as his world grew, mine shrank. Calls became briefer, updates vaguer, his tone increasingly polite, like a social obligation. Once, I heard him say to someone on speakerphone, "She raised me, technically, but it was more complicated than that." I stood frozen in the hallway, phone still in my hand. I wasn't looking for a medal. I never needed a parade, but I had hoped, in the quiet corners of his achievements, I might be remembered. Not as a shadow, not as technically just as the woman who stayed up sewing buttons on his only formal shirt for his first debate, as the voice that rehearsed lines with him until midnight, as the heartbeat that never once wavered even when his pride grew louder than our history. And yet, there I stood erased with precision, as if love, when invisible, ceases to exist. As if giving everything without applause makes the gesture forgettable. I started collecting the little evidences, bank statements with his school's name, faded receipts from bookstores, scribbled notes with deadlines he once forgot, and I never did. I wasn't planning to confront him. I wasn't angry in the traditional sense. There was just this echo inside me, louder every year, whispering, "You were there." And maybe that's all I was trying to do, prove to myself that I didn't. Imagine the years, the sacrifices, the late-night bus stops, and the early morning shifts. I remembered the email I sent when his tuition spiked, and the silence that followed. He never replied, but the transaction cleared. It always did. That was the nature of our bond. I gave. He moved forward. But now, sitting alone with those pieces of proof, I saw how quiet giving could become erasure if no one ever looked back. If no one ever said, "She made this possible." The hardest part wasn't the lack of credit. It was the realization that maybe he had rewritten our story for himself, trimming out the parts that didn't fit his new image. And if I ever showed up, if I ever reminded him gently of where he came from, it would feel like an interruption. Instead of a return, I folded the documents back into their envelopes and placed them in a box under my bed. Not out of shame, but because I knew one day someone might ask. Maybe not him, but someone. And when they did, I'd have more than a memory. I'd have the silent evidence of a woman who built a life beneath someone else's spotlight and never once asked for it to shine back. The gala wasn't for me, none of those events ever were. But I went anyway, sitting in the last row in a modest dress, the same one I wore to his graduation because I couldn't justify buying a new one. The program booklet listed the sponsors, the donors, the names that mattered. Mine wasn't there, of course it wasn't, but I recognized the foundation he credited on stage. I remembered how it started through a connection I had quietly arranged, offering my own savings as a temporary guarantee when his first scholarship fell through. He was magnetic that night, confident and articulate, thanking mentors, friends, and his wife who beamed as he spoke. He said something like, "Everyone here shaped my journey," and paused for applause. But I didn't clap. Not because I wasn't proud. I just couldn't pretend anymore. The story he was telling had no room for the woman who skipped lunch for years, who pawned her mother's necklace when the financial aid office delayed payment. She was invisible, or worse, uncomfortable. I watched him work the room afterward, shaking hands, posing for photos, and I wondered if he ever saw me in the corner. Not just tonight, but all those other times in the cold waiting room, in the shadows of his dorm, move-in day, outside the classroom door where I once stood so he wouldn't be late. Maybe it was easier for him if I didn't exist in those stories. Maybe acknowledging me meant admitting that brilliance sometimes stands on tired, aching shoulders. I stepped outside for air, pressing my back against the cold stone wall of the venue. The night was too elegant for tears, so I blinked hard and kept my posture straight. Inside, laughter spilled from the open doors, glasses clinking, old classmates reminiscing like no time had passed. I could hear his voice, his laugh always rose above others. It used to be my favorite sound. I remembered when he was 12 and had a fever the night before his placement exam. I stayed up soaking towels in cold water, whispering multiplication tables between thermometer checks. He passed that exam, got into the school that started everything. He used to call it our win. Now he walked past me like I was the driver, Who dropped him off? I looked down at my shoes scuffed but clean and remembered how I'd returned a dress just to afford them. Behind me, a woman complimented the flowers. His wife did a wonderful job organizing, she said. I wanted to correct her to say that I'd helped book the florist 6 months ago, that I'd mailed the deposit from a borrowed account to keep things under his name, but I didn't, because those truths don't matter once someone decides you're just from the past. I wasn't a mother. I was a shadow, a background character he'd long edited out of his success story. And maybe that's what hurt most, that the erasure wasn't accidental. It was curated, designed. He had rewritten the story so thoroughly, even I was starting to believe I'd never been there to begin with. I sat quietly on the stone bench near the courtyard fountain, watching as people began taking photos by the ivy-covered walls. He was there too, posing, smiling, looking exactly like the future I once sacrificed everything to help build. One of the guests asked, "So who supported you most during all those years?" His answer came smooth, confident, honestly. "I did it all on my own." The words hit harder than I expected. They weren't just casual forgetfulness. They were intentional. His voice didn't even waver, not a pause, not a moment of reflection. Just the clean revision of a narrative he'd now memorized. I reached into my bag and held the last letter. I wrote him before his scholarship renewal. I never mailed it, was too emotional. In it, I told him I'd sold the last of my jewelry to cover his unpaid tuition balance, that I never regretted a single sacrifice, only that we had grown distant. I almost tore it in half then, but something stopped me. Maybe because the truth deserves to exist somewhere, even if it's silent. I watched him from across the lawn, his wife proudly introducing him to new friends as the man who made it. Against all odds, I wasn't even a footnote. I realized, in that moment, I was no longer angry, just emptied. Grief has a shape, but erasure is formless. I stood, smoothed my dress, and walked away, not because I gave up, but because I finally understood. I'd spent my life showing up for someone who spent his rewriting mine out. The next morning, I found myself rereading old letters, ones he wrote during his first year away, still filled with gratitude, longing, and promises to return. The contrast between those words and his recent silence was staggering. Back then, he called me his anchor, his constant. He said my voice kept him grounded when the city felt overwhelming. Now, he was anchored elsewhere, and I had become invisible. I sat with a cup of tea in the kitchen, the same kitchen I had painted twice while he was at school, believing one day he'd bring his family to visit. I imagined little feet running down the hallway, calling me Grandma. I had rehearsed my smile for that moment more times than I could count. Instead, all I got was a photo online or dinner party with new people, a toast to his journey, and a caption, "Made it here by myself." No mention of the woman who skipped meals to send money. No photo of the home where he grew up. It wasn't pride that kept me from calling him. It was clarity. He had built a new world and made sure it had no doors back to me. I stood up slowly, went to my drawer, and took out the binder with all his receipts. Every plane ticket, every check stub, every confirmation email from the school. Not as evidence, not for confrontation, but because the truth had to exist somewhere. Even if not in his mouth, it would remain in my hands. My love deserved to be archived, even if never acknowledged. I walked to the small chest in my bedroom, the one that held the keepsakes I had guarded like relics. Inside was the first draft of his application, essay, one I helped him rewrite late into the night, fixing grammar and tightening sentences while he paced nervously. Next to it was the embroidered towel from his dorm's welcome kit, which he sent back as a joke, saying their laundry soap smelled like broken dreams. I kept it anyway. I kept everything, because to me, every detail mattered. It wasn't about control. It was about love that didn't vanish just because he outgrew the house it lived in. I pulled out the copy of the school's fundraising report from 3 years ago. My name was listed in the donor sections, small, printed in fine font. No one ever asked where the money came from. No one thought to. I suppose that's how quiet sacrifices work. They don't echo unless someone's listening, and he wasn't. Not anymore, but I was still listening to myself. To the part of me that still believed dignity was louder than bitterness, I placed the documents into an envelope and sealed it. I didn't plan to mail it. I just needed to close something sacred that only I would know existed. The woman behind the tuition, behind the meal plans, behind the warm sweaters in winter, she was still here. She had simply stopped waiting for credit. Because maybe motherhood isn't about being remembered loudly. Maybe it's just about giving, fully, painfully, and without applause. But even if I wasn't invited to the speech, I had lived every sentence he forgot to say that night. I took one last look at the framed photo of his graduation, the one he never asked if I wanted. I remembered where I stood that day, behind the crowd, clutching my coat against the wind. too proud to wave, too heartbroken to cry. I remembered how the cheers erupted when his name was called, and how I whispered a silent, "You did it." Though he never turned to see me, I had made peace with the idea that my face wouldn't be in the official pictures. But I never imagined being erased entirely. Not once. In all the interviews he gave or the articles written about his success, was there a mention of me? No single mother, no late nights studying together, no thank you for believing. Just stories of overcoming as if love had not paved every inch of his path. I stood, walked to my closet and picked out the scarf he gave me at the end of his first semester. It still smelled like hope. I wrapped it around my shoulders and stepped outside for air. The night was cold and the stars were distant, but I felt something settle in me, a quiet truth. I didn't need a microphone to matter. I didn't need an audience to be real. I had built a life around someone who now chose to forget me, but that didn't make my love any less sacred. He could tell the world whatever version suited him. I wouldn't correct him, but I would never again fund a story I wasn't allowed to exist in. The letter came 3 weeks later. Thick envelope. Embossed logo. I almost didn't open it. Thought it was another fundraising campaign from the university, asking for more. But inside was a handwritten note. Not from him but from the department head. Apparently he had mentioned in a private conversation how his family couldn't afford much, and how a mysterious donor had helped all those years ago. Somehow, someone connected the dots. They were naming a small bench in the campus. Garden after me. Nothing grand. Just a plaque, with my name and the words, "In gratitude for unseen support." I sat down at my kitchen table and let that line sink in. It wasn't about public recognition. It never had been. But in that moment I felt seen, not as a background character or a forgotten assistant to someone else's dreams, but as the foundation, the quiet architecture of someone's becoming. I folded the letter gently and placed it next to the envelope I had never mailed. Funny how things come back around, not always from the people we expect, but sometimes from the world itself. A strange kind of grace. I didn't need him to rewrite his story. I had mine, and it held truths he might never know how to carry, but I did. I always had. And perhaps, for the first time, that was enough. I went to see the bench a month later. It was a quiet morning, the kind he used to like when he was younger, fogey still. The kind that makes you whisper even when there's no one around. I brought coffee in a thermos and sat there for an hour just watching students pass by. Some of them looked exhausted, some excited, some just lost in their own worlds. And I realized that's how it's always been. We give, they go, and we stay behind, quietly hoping they remember. I didn't cry. I thought I might, but I didn't. There was a calm I hadn't felt in years. Like I had finally exhaled something I'd been holding since the day I let him go chase whatever it was he thought he needed. He could keep pretending I never existed. He could keep rewriting me out of his speeches, his stories, his new life. But there, carved into the wood, was a truth he couldn't erase. I had given everything I had, and now the world, in its own quiet way, had written it back. I stood up, touched the plaque, and whispered I was here. Not for him to hear. For me, for the part of me that kept breaking every time he said I wasn't, and for every mother, every woman, every silent giver who never got a thank you. This was for us. Proof that we exist, that we mattered. Even if they never said it, the plaque simply read, "In honor of the woman who paid every semester." No names, no signature, just the truth. A truth too heavy for him to carry, too inconvenient to include in his perfect narrative. But there it was, checkable, permanent, carved into metal. I didn't need applause. I didn't need a seat at his banquet or a post on his page. I just needed this one moment of stillness, this quiet reclaiming of who I had been all along. As I walked away from the bench, I didn't look back. Not because I wasn't proud, but because I didn't need his acknowledgement anymore. That boy I had raised was now a man wrapped in his own pride, and I had no room left for waiting. What I had given was not a loan, it was a legacy. And legacies, no matter how deeply buried, always find the light. I got in the car, turned the key, and as the engine hummed, I finally smiled, not out of spite, not out of victory, but from the soft freedom of knowing I had nothing left to prove. Some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to endure. I drove off, wind against the window, leaving behind the weight of his silence. He could have had both, the stage and the one who lit the way to it, but he chose the spotlight over the roots. And now, I had chosen peace. Have you ever carried someone so far, only for them to act like they walked alone?